June 6, 1944. While thousands of Allied soldiers stormed the beaches of Normandy in the largest amphibious invasion in human history, Adolf Hitler sat in his war room absolutely convinced that the real invasion would happen somewhere else. He kept his panzer divisions, the most feared armored units on the planet, frozen in place 150 miles away from the actual battlefield, waiting for an attack that would never come. The supreme commander of Nazi Germany, the man who had conquered most of Europe, had been fooled. But here's what will blow your mind. The person who deceived him wasn't a general, wasn't a highly trained CIA operative, and wasn't even British. He was a failed chicken farmer from Spain who spoke broken English, had been rejected by both the Allies and the Nazis when he first tried to become a spy, and yet somehow managed to create the most successful deception operation in military history. His code name was Garbo, and by the end of this video, you'll understand why historians believe that without him, D-Day could have been the bloodiest failure of World War II. London, 1941. The city was burning. Every night German bombers turned the sky orange, dropping tons of explosives on civilians, hospitals and churches. Britain stood alone against the Nazi war machine. France had fallen. The Soviet Union was on the verge of collapse. America hadn't entered the war yet. Winston Churchill knew that if Britain was going to survive, they needed more than guns and planes. They needed to get inside Hitler's head. That's when British intelligence, specifically a secretive unit called MI5, began one of the most desperate recruitment drives in espionage history. They were looking for agents who could infiltrate the Nazi intelligence network, the Abwehr, and feed them false information. But there was a problem. Most trained British spies were already known to the Germans. They needed someone unexpected, someone the Nazis would never suspect. They needed someone who could lie so convincingly that even the most paranoid intelligence officers in the Third Reich would believe him. They just didn't know it yet. Meanwhile, in Lisbon, Portugal, a neutral city crawling with spies from every nation, a strange man walked into the British embassy with an outrageous proposal. His name was Juan Pujol García, a 29-year-old Spaniard with no formal education, no military training, and no connections to any intelligence service. He was short, wore thick glasses, and had the kind of forgettable face that blended into any crowd. He had survived the Spanish Civil War by pretending to support both sides, a skill that would later make him the greatest double agent of all time. He told the British officer at the embassy that he wanted to spy for them against Nazi Germany. The officer looked at him, laughed, and sent him away. The British didn't believe him. They thought he was either a lunatic or, worse, a Nazi plant. So Juan Pujol did something insane. He decided to become a spy anyway, without anyone's permission. He went to the German embassy in Madrid and told them he could spy for the Third Reich. He claimed he had connections in London, that he traveled frequently to Britain, and that he hated the English with a passion. The Germans, desperate for intelligence on British military plans, believed him. They gave him a code name, Alaric, secret ink, money, and instructions to begin sending reports immediately. There was just one problem. Juan Pujol had never been to Britain in his entire life. He didn't have a visa, didn't have contacts, and didn't speak fluent English. He was sitting in a tiny apartment in Lisbon, pretending to be in London, and somehow he had to convince the German intelligence service that he was their most valuable asset in enemy territory. So he bought a blue guide to England, a map of Britain, and a Portuguese-English dictionary. He studied train schedules, weather reports, and British newspapers available in Lisbon. Then he started writing reports to the Germans, describing in vivid detail the military installations he was supposedly observing in England, the troop movements he was allegedly tracking, and the secrets he was supposedly stealing. And here's the terrifying part. The Germans believed every single word. They had no idea that their star agent was inventing everything from a cheap hotel room in Portugal, that the British secrets they were receiving were cobbled together from outdated guidebooks and public information. Juan Pujol García had just pulled off the impossible. He had infiltrated Nazi intelligence entirely on his own, and he was making it up as he went along. For months, Juan Pujol sat in his Lisbon apartment, churning out fake intelligence reports to the Germans, with the dedication of a novelist writing his masterpiece. He invented detailed observations about British ports, described imaginary convoys departing from Liverpool, and even created fictional contacts, dock workers, government officials, Royal Air Force pilots, who were feeding him secrets. The Abwehr ate it up. They paid him more money, sent him more instructions, and began circulating his reports to the highest levels of German military intelligence. But Juan Pujol had a problem that was about to expose him. He had never actually seen Britain, and his reports were starting to contain mistakes. He described trains arriving in towns where no trains ran, mentioned military bases in locations where none existed, and got basic British geography catastrophically wrong. Yet somehow, the Germans never questioned him. They wanted to believe they had a master spy in London so badly that they ignored the red flags. But the British were starting to notice something very strange. MI5, Britain's counterintelligence agency, had cracked the German Enigma codes and could read secret Nazi communications. They started seeing references to a mysterious agent codenamed Alaric, who was supposedly operating in Britain and sending valuable reports to Berlin. The problem was MI5 had no idea who this person was. They checked all known German spies in Britain, most of whom they had already captured and either imprisoned or turned into double agents, and none of them matched the profile. It was driving British intelligence crazy. Who was this phantom agent? How was he operating without their knowledge? And more importantly, if the Germans had someone this good on British soil, why hadn't he caused any real damage yet? The head of the British double-cross system, a brilliant officer named Tommy Harris, became obsessed with finding Alaric. Then, in early 1942, MI5 intercepted a message that changed everything. The Abwehr was praising Alaric for a report about a convoy of ships that had supposedly left Liverpool heading for Malta. The British checked their records and realized no such convoy had ever existed. That's when they understood the truth. Alaric wasn't a German spy operating in Britain. He was somewhere else, making everything up. The British launched an urgent search across neutral territories, and finally, through a contact in the American embassy in Lisbon, they found him. Juan Pujol García, the failed chicken farmer who had been rejected by British intelligence a year earlier, was not only alive but running circles around the entire German intelligence apparatus. When MI5 officers finally made contact with him in Lisbon, they couldn't believe what they were hearing. This unassuming Spaniard, with no training and no resources, had single-handedly created a fake spy network and convinced the Nazis he was their most valuable asset in England. The British realized they weren't dealing with a wannabe spy, they were dealing with a natural-born genius at deception. They immediately smuggled him out of Portugal and brought him to London in April 1942. His new handlers gave him a new codename, one that reflected his extraordinary talent for performance. Garbo, after the Swedish actress Greta Garbo, because, like her, he was the greatest actor in the world. Now officially working for the British, Juan Pujol's operation moved from amateur improvisation to professional-grade psychological warfare. MI5 set him up in a safe house in North London with a dedicated team of handlers, cryptographers, and writers whose sole job was to help Garbo perfect his deception. But here's what made the operation brilliant. The British didn't shut down Garbo's fake spy network. They expanded it. Together with his handlers, Garbo began inventing an entire organization of sub-agents, each with detailed backstories, personalities, and specialties. There was Agent 1, a Portuguese man living in South Wales who supposedly worked in the docks. Agent 2 was a Swiss businessman in London with access to government contracts. Agent 3 was a Venezuelan student in Glasgow who hated Britain and sympathized with fascism. None of these people existed. They were characters in an elaborate fiction, but Garbo wrote about them with such detail. Their marriages, their financial problems, their illnesses, their political views, that the Germans came to trust them as real human beings. The Abwehr was ecstatic. They believed they had an entire spy network operating across Britain, feeding them secrets about Allied military plans. They gave Garbo more money, more radio equipment, and more responsibility. German intelligence officers in Berlin and Madrid built their strategic assessments around the information Garbo provided. Hitler himself was reading reports that originated from Garbo's invented agents. And here's the terrifying beauty of the operation. Everything Garbo sent to the Germans was technically true, but completely useless. The British fed him real information about troop movements, but only after those movements had already happened. They gave him accurate details about military operations, but only after those operations were no longer secret. The Germans thought they were getting priceless intelligence when, in reality, they were getting yesterday's news dressed up as today's secrets. Garbo had become the most trusted source in the Nazi intelligence network, and he was leading them exactly where the British wanted them to go. By 1943, Garbo had achieved something almost impossible in the world of espionage. He had become indispensable to the enemy. The Germans trusted him more than their own field officers. They relied on his reports to make strategic decisions. They paid him a small fortune, money that the British quietly deposited into accounts they controlled. But trust, in the spy game, is a double-edged sword. The more the Germans believed in Garbo, the more careful he had to be. One mistake, one inconsistency, one piece of information that didn't match reality, and the entire operation would collapse. The Abwehr would realize they'd been deceived, and worse, they'd know that British intelligence had been inside their communications for years. So Garbo and his handlers at MI5 developed a strategy that would become legendary in the history of deception. They would sacrifice small truths to protect the big lie. They would occasionally give the Germans real, valuable intelligence, but always too late for them to act on it. The first major test came in the summer of 1943, when the Allies were preparing to invade Sicily as part of their campaign to knock Italy out of the war. The British knew the Germans suspected an invasion somewhere in the Mediterranean, but they didn't know where. WWII launched Operation Mincemeat, the famous scheme where they planted false documents on a corpse and floated it off the coast of Spain to convince the Germans the invasion would hit Greece and Sardinia, not Sicily. Garbo played a supporting role in that operation, sending reports from his fictitious agents that seemed to confirm the false information. But the real test of his credibility came after the invasion actually happened. Garbo sent an urgent message to the Germans, warning them that the Allies were about to invade Sicily, but he sent it just hours before the attack began, too late for the German military to reposition their forces. When the invasion succeeded, the Abwehr didn't blame Garbo for failing to warn them in time. Instead, they praised him for being right and blamed themselves for not acting faster on his intelligence. It was a masterclass in manipulation. Garbo had made the Germans feel guilty for not trusting him enough. Now the British knew they had a weapon unlike any other. Garbo wasn't just a spy. He was a psychological infrastructure, a narrative the Germans had built their entire understanding of British intentions around. And MI5 realized that if they played this correctly, they could use Garbo to pull off the greatest military deception in history. In early 1944, the Allies were planning Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy that would open a second front in Western Europe and begin the liberation of France. But everyone knew the Germans were expecting an invasion. They had fortified the entire Atlantic coast with the Atlantic Wall, a network of bunkers, artillery positions, and obstacles designed to slaughter any invasion force before it even reached the beach. The question wasn't whether the Allies could land in France. The question was whether they could survive long enough to establish a foothold. The answer depended on one critical factor. Where would Hitler send his reserves when the invasion started? The German military had powerful panzer divisions stationed in France, particularly the 15th Army near Calais and the panzer divisions under Field Marshal Rommel's command. If Hitler sent those tanks to Normandy in the first hours of the invasion, the Allied soldiers on those beaches would be massacred. But if the Germans could be convinced that Normandy was just a diversion, that the real invasion was coming somewhere else, specifically at Pas-de-Calais, the narrowest point between England and France, then Hitler might hold his tanks back, waiting for an attack that would never come. That's where Garbo came in. The British began constructing the most elaborate deception operation of the war, Operation Fortitude. The goal was simple but staggering in scope: convince Hitler that the Allies were building a massive invasion force in southeastern England, commanded by General George Patton, aimed directly at Calais. And Garbo would be the one to sell that lie. For months leading up to D-Day, Garbo's network of fictitious agents sent a steady stream of reports to Berlin describing the buildup of this phantom army. Agent 4 reported seeing tank formations in Kent. Agent 7, supposedly a Welsh nationalist soldier, described American troops massing near Dover. The British even built fake military installations, inflatable tanks, plywood aircraft and dummy landing craft that Garbo's agents could observe and report on. The Germans sent reconnaissance planes to photograph these fake bases, and the images seemed to confirm everything Garbo was telling them. Meanwhile, the actual invasion force was assembling on the southern coast of England, in places like Portsmouth and Southampton. But Garbo's reports cleverly downplayed activity in those areas, describing them as minor staging points for a diversionary attack. The Germans, reading Garbo's intelligence alongside other sources that MI5 had carefully coordinated, became convinced that Patton's First Army Group, which didn't actually exist, was the real threat, and that any attack on Normandy would be a feint designed to draw German forces away from Calais before the main blow fell. As June 1944 approached, the pressure on Garbo became suffocating. The entire success of D-Day, the lives of hundreds of thousands of Allied soldiers, now rested on whether the Germans would believe his final reports. MI5 knew that the most dangerous moment wouldn't be before the invasion, but immediately after it started. The moment Allied troops hit the beaches of Normandy, German intelligence would know an invasion was underway. Hitler would have to make a decision: send his panzer divisions to Normandy immediately, or wait to see if this was the diversion Garbo had been warning about. If Hitler hesitated even for 24 hours, it could mean the difference between catastrophic Allied casualties and a successful foothold in France. So Garbo and his handlers designed a plan so audacious, so risky, that if it failed it would expose the entire British deception apparatus and possibly cost the Allies the war. Garbo would send a message to the Germans on the night of June 5th, just hours before the invasion, warning them that something big was about to happen. But he would frame it in a way that made the Normandy landings seem like exactly what the Allies wanted the Germans to think it wasn't: a diversion. On the evening of June 5th, 1944, Garbo sat down at his radio transmitter in his London safe house and prepared to send the most important message of his life. His hands were steady, but everyone in the room knew what was at stake. He began tapping out an urgent alert to his German handlers in Madrid. His agents had observed massive troop movements, unusual activity at ports in southern England, and signs that an operation was imminent. He requested an emergency meeting with his German contact at 3 in the morning London time. But here's the genius of the plan. MI5 had deliberately scheduled Garbo's transmission for a time when they knew the German radio operator in Madrid would not be at his post. The message went out into the void unanswered. Garbo tried again an hour later. Still nothing. He sent a third message, increasingly frantic, warning that something catastrophic was about to happen, and that Berlin needed to be alerted immediately. The Germans never received the warning in time. At dawn on June 6th, the largest amphibious invasion in history began. Thousands of ships crossed the English Channel, and American, British and Canadian troops stormed 5 beaches along the Normandy coast under withering German fire. When the German radio operator finally came on duty in Madrid, hours after the landings had begun, and saw Garbo's frantic messages, he immediately forwarded them to Berlin with an apology for the delay. The Abwehr was horrified. Their best agent had tried to warn them, and they had missed it. Garbo, in a carefully scripted performance of outrage, sent a blistering message to his handlers. He had risked everything to provide advance warning of the invasion, and they had failed to receive it because of incompetence. He questioned whether he should continue working for an organization that didn't take his intelligence seriously. The Germans panicked. They apologized profusely, promised it would never happen again, and begged him to continue his work. They even awarded him the Iron Cross, one of Nazi Germany's highest military honors, for his loyalty and service. Garbo had just pulled off the impossible. He had failed to prevent the D-Day landings, and the Germans loved him even more for it. But the real masterstroke was still to come. Within hours of the Normandy landings, Hitler and his generals gathered to assess the situation. Reports were flooding in from the front. The Allies had established beachheads at 5 points along the coast. but German defenses were holding in some areas, and the outcome was still uncertain. The critical question obsessing every German commander was simple. Is this the main invasion, or is it a diversion? Rommel wanted to throw every available panzer division at Normandy immediately, crush the beachheads before the Allies could reinforce them, and drive the invaders back into the sea. But Hitler hesitated. He had been reading Garbo's intelligence for months, and everything Garbo had reported suggested that the real invasion would come at Calais, led by Patton's army group. If Hitler committed his reserves to Normandy, and then the main attack hit Calais, he would have no forces left to defend the most direct route to Germany. So he waited. He kept his panzer divisions frozen in place, watching the coast near Calais for an attack that existed only in Garbo's imagination. On June 9th, 3 days after D-Day, Garbo sent his masterpiece, a long, detailed intelligence report summarizing everything his network had observed. He confirmed that yes, an invasion had occurred at Normandy, but his agents were reporting that the bulk of Patton's forces in southeastern England had not moved. The dummy army, the fake tanks, the inflatable landing craft, they were all still there, visible to German reconnaissance. Garbo's message was clear. Normandy is a diversion. The real invasion is still coming at Calais, and if you send your reserves to Normandy now, you'll be walking into exactly the trap the Allies have set for you. The German High Command received this message, and incredibly, they believed it. Hitler ordered his commanders to hold the line in Normandy, but to keep the 15th Army and the Panzer reserves in place near Calais. For 7 critical weeks after D-Day, an entire German army sat idle, waiting for an invasion that would never come, while the Allies poured men and equipment into Normandy and began their breakout across France. By the time the Germans realized they had been deceived, it was too late. The war in Western Europe had turned. In the weeks following D-Day, while American and British forces fought desperately to expand their foothold in Normandy, Garbo continued to send reports that kept the German 15th Army paralyzed near Calais. His fictitious agents reported seeing continued build-up in southeastern England, described new divisions arriving from America supposedly destined for Patton's Phantom Army Group, and even invented reconnaissance missions that confirmed the presence of invasion barges still waiting in Dover and other channel ports. The Germans were so convinced by Garbo's intelligence that they actually reinforced the Calais area, pulling troops away from other sectors to defend against an attack that existed only on paper. Hitler personally reviewed Garbo's reports and praised the quality of his intelligence network. German field marshals planned defensive strategies based on Garbo's information. The Abwehr considered him their most reliable source on Allied intentions. And every single day that the Germans waited for the real invasion at Calais was another day the Allies used to pour reinforcements into Normandy, another day closer to breaking out of the beachhead and beginning the liberation of France. By mid-July, when the Allies finally launched Operation Cobra and shattered the German lines in Normandy, it was too late for Hitler to redeploy his northern armies effectively. The deception had worked beyond anyone's wildest expectations. But Garbo's value to the Allied cause didn't end with Normandy. As the war continued and Allied forces pushed across France toward Germany, MI5 realized they had a problem. They needed to keep Garbo's credibility intact for as long as possible, because British intelligence was already planning deceptions for future operations. If the Germans discovered that Garbo had been lying to them, they would question every piece of intelligence they had received over the past 3 years, potentially unraveling other British double-agent operations and compromising the security of ongoing military plans. So Garbo's handlers devised an exit strategy. They began gradually killing off some of his sub-agents in ways that seemed tragic but believable. Agent 3 supposedly died in combat when he was conscripted into the British Army. Agent 5 disappeared after getting into financial trouble and fleeing to avoid creditors. These fictional deaths served 2 purposes. They reduced the number of agents Garbo had to maintain, making his workload manageable, and they added emotional realism to his reports. The Germans sent condolences and even financial support to the widows of these invented agents, further cementing their belief in the reality of Garbo's network. By late 1944, as Allied victory became increasingly inevitable, the British faced another challenge: how to shut down Garbo's operation without arousing German suspicion, and how to protect Juan Pujol's identity after the war ended. The Abwehr was collapsing as Germany itself crumbled, but die-hard Nazis and SS officers were already planning for a post-war underground resistance, and anyone who had betrayed the Reich would be hunted. MI5 decided to stage Garbo's death. In early 1945, Garbo sent increasingly desperate messages to his German handlers, describing how British counterintelligence was closing in on his network, how several of his remaining agents had been arrested, and how he himself was being watched. Then, in his final transmission, he reported that he was going into deep hiding and would cease all communications to avoid capture. After that, silence. The Germans assumed that their greatest spy had either been arrested by MI5 or had successfully gone underground. In reality, Juan Pujol García was sitting safely in London, preparing for the next chapter of his extraordinary life. When the war ended in May 1945, the full scale of Garbo's contribution began to emerge. Allied intelligence officers who reviewed German military records captured after the surrender were stunned to discover how completely the Nazi high command had been deceived. German documents showed that Hitler had kept entire divisions near Calais until late July 1944, more than 6 weeks after D-Day, specifically because of intelligence reports from Garbo's network. Military historians later calculated that Garbo's deception had diverted or delayed the deployment of approximately 150,000 German troops and hundreds of tanks during the critical weeks when the Allies were most vulnerable in Normandy. General Dwight Eisenhower, the Supreme Commander of Allied forces, was briefed on the Garbo operation and reportedly said that the deception had saved thousands of Allied lives and possibly shortened the war by months. The British government, in a secret ceremony, awarded Juan Pujol the Member of the Order of the British Empire, one of the highest civilian honors. But here's the absolutely insane part. The Germans had already given him the Iron Cross for his service to the Third Reich. Juan Pujol García remains the only person in history to receive military honors from both sides during World War II. But Juan Pujol didn't want medals or recognition. He wanted to disappear. The end of the war didn't mean the end of danger for double agents. Former Nazis were being hunted by Allied war crimes investigators, but former Nazi collaborators were also being hunted by Nazi sympathizers seeking revenge. Juan Pujol knew that if his identity as Garbo ever became public, he would spend the rest of his life looking over his shoulder. So MI5 helped him vanish. They created a false identity, provided him with forged papers, and helped him slip out of Britain. The official story released to the few intelligence officers who knew about Garbo was that Juan Pujol had died of malaria in Angola in 1949. His grave was registered, his death certificate was filed, and the greatest double agent in history was erased from the record. For the next 3 decades, the world believed Juan Pujol García was dead, and the man himself did everything in his power to make sure it stayed that way. Juan Pujol García didn't die in Angola. He moved to Venezuela, settled in the capital city of Caracas, and started a completely new life under a false name. He opened a small business, a bookshop and gift store, and tried to live as normally as possible. He married, had children, and never told anyone, not his wife, not his kids, not his closest friends, about what he had done during the war. To his family, he was just an ordinary Spanish immigrant who had fled Europe after the chaos of World War II. He spoke vague stories about working odd jobs during the war years, nothing dramatic, nothing heroic. His children grew up never knowing that their quiet, unassuming father had fooled Adolf Hitler, saved thousands of lives, and changed the course of history. For nearly 30 years, Juan Pujol lived in complete anonymity, running his modest shop in Caracas, blending into the fabric of everyday life in South America. And he was content with that. He had survived the war, survived the peace, and successfully disappeared. But the past, no matter how deeply buried, has a way of resurfacing. In the 1970s, a British writer and former intelligence officer named Nigel West became obsessed with cracking one of the great mysteries of World War II espionage. He had been researching the history of MI5's double-cross system, the network of captured and turned German spies that Britain had used to feed disinformation to the Nazis. West had access to declassified documents, old reports, and interviews with retired intelligence officers, and one name kept appearing in the records with almost mythical reverence: Garbo. The files described an agent who had single-handedly created a fake spy network, deceived the German High Command, and played a critical role in the success of D-Day. But every document referred to him only by his code name. His real identity had been scrubbed from the official record, and according to MI5's files, he had died in Africa in 1949. But Nigel West didn't believe it. Something about the story felt wrong, too convenient, too neat. He suspected that the death had been faked, that Garbo might still be alive somewhere, hiding under a false identity. West spent years following leads that went nowhere. He interviewed dozens of former intelligence officers, searched through Spanish Civil War records, and combed through immigration documents from Portugal and Britain. Most people told him he was wasting his time, that even if Garbo had survived the war, he would be an old man by now, possibly dead and certainly untraceable. But West was relentless. He finally got a break when he found a former MI5 handler who had worked with Garbo during the war, and who, after much persuasion, admitted that the death in Angola had been staged. The handler didn't know where Juan Pujol had gone, but he remembered small personal details: Juan's love of books, his fascination with languages, his desire to live somewhere warm and far from Europe. West began searching immigration records for Spanish nationals who had moved to Latin America in the late 1940s, focusing on men who matched Juan Pujol's age and background. It was like searching for a ghost, but eventually he found a name that fit. A Juan Garcia, no middle name listed, who had entered Venezuela in 1949 and had registered a small business in Caracas in the early 1950s. In 1984, Nigel West traveled to Caracas with nothing but a name, an address that might be decades out of date, and a hunch. He found the bookshop, walked inside, and saw an elderly man behind the counter, organizing shelves with the careful precision of someone who had spent a lifetime paying attention to details. West approached cautiously and asked in Spanish if he was Juan Pujol García. The old man froze, his face going pale. For a long, terrible moment he didn't answer. Then slowly he nodded. West explained who he was, that he wasn't there to expose him or hurt him, but simply to tell his story, to make sure the world knew what he had done. Juan Pujol listened, and then he did something unexpected. He started to cry, not from fear but from relief. For 35 years, he had carried the weight of his secret alone, unable to share it with anyone, unable to be recognized for the most important thing he had ever done. He had saved thousands of lives, and no one knew. He had beaten the Nazis at their own game, and history had forgotten him. Juan Pujol agreed to work with Nigel West on one condition: that his story would only be published after he was certain that no former Nazis or Nazi sympathizers could retaliate against him or his family. West agreed, and over the following months, Juan Pujol began to tell his story in full for the first time. He described the fear, the exhilaration, the absurdity of sitting in a Lisbon apartment inventing an entire spy network from a travel guide and a dictionary. He explained how he had hated both fascism and communism, how he had seen the horrors of the Spanish Civil War and decided that the only way to fight totalitarianism was through deception, not violence. He talked about the loneliness of being Garbo, of knowing that one mistake could cost the lives of tens of thousands of soldiers. And he revealed something that stunned West. Even during the height of the Garbo operation, when the Germans trusted him completely and the British celebrated him as their greatest asset, Juan Pujol had been terrified every single day that someone would see through the illusion, that the house of cards he had built would collapse, and that he would be responsible for one of the greatest disasters in military history. In 1984, when Nigel West's book about Garbo was published, the world finally learned the truth about Juan Pujol García. The book, titled Garbo, the Spy Who Saved D-Day, became an international sensation. Historians who had spent decades studying World War II were stunned. Veterans who had stormed the beaches of Normandy realized that their survival might have been owed to a man they had never heard of. Intelligence agencies around the world studied the Garbo operation as a textbook example of how deception, when executed perfectly, could be more powerful than armies. Juan Pujol, now in his 70s, suddenly found himself thrust back into the spotlight he had spent most of his life avoiding. Journalists descended on Caracas, requesting interviews. Documentary filmmakers wanted to tell his story. The British government, which had kept his identity secret for 4 decades, now publicly acknowledged his contributions and invited him back to London. And in one of the most extraordinary moments of his life, Juan Pujol was invited to visit the beaches of Normandy on the 40th anniversary of D-Day in June 1984, to walk the sand where thousands of Allied soldiers had fought and died while German panzers sat frozen miles away because of the lies he had told. When Juan Pujol stood on Omaha Beach that day, surrounded by aging veterans and foreign dignitaries, he was overwhelmed. He had never seen the place where his deception had its greatest impact. He had never walked the ground where young men had charged into machine gun fire, where medics had tried desperately to save the wounded, where the fate of the free world had been decided in blood and courage. The veterans who met him there didn't treat him like a curiosity or a relic from a forgotten operation. They treated him like a brother. They shook his hand, embraced him and thanked him. Some of them cried. They told him that they had always wondered why the German tanks hadn't come in those first critical days, why the enemy reinforcements had been so slow to arrive, why they had been given just enough time to dig in and survive. Now they knew. One elderly American paratrooper, who had jumped into Normandy in the dark hours before dawn on June 6th, gripped Juan's shoulders and said something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. "You gave us a chance. That's all we needed. Just a chance." Juan Pujol had spent 40 years wondering if what he had done had mattered, if his strange, solitary war of fiction and lies had made any real difference. Standing on that beach, he finally had his answer. But fame was uncomfortable for Juan Pujol. He had spent so long living as someone else, hiding his past, that being celebrated as Garbo felt surreal and sometimes dangerous. He returned to Venezuela after the commemorations in Normandy, but the quiet anonymity he had cherished was gone forever. People recognized him on the street. His family, who had learned the truth about his wartime activities only when the book was published, struggled to reconcile the mild-mannered bookshop owner they knew with the master spy the world was celebrating. His children were proud but also bewildered. How had their father kept this secret for so long? How had he lived an entire double life without ever slipping up? Juan tried to explain that the skills that had made him a great spy were the same skills that had kept him hidden: attention to detail, patience, and the ability to become completely invisible when necessary. He had been playing a role his entire adult life, first as a German spy who didn't exist, then as a British double agent pretending to be that German spy, and finally as an ordinary man pretending he had never been a spy at all. The attention eventually faded, as it always does, and Juan Pujol returned to a quieter existence in his final years. He continued to live in Venezuela, though he traveled occasionally to Britain and Spain for interviews, documentaries, and ceremonies. He became friends with some of the historians and intelligence officers who studied his case, answering their questions and providing insights into how the operation had worked. But he always insisted that he hadn't been a hero in the traditional sense. He had never fired a gun, never stormed a building, never rescued anyone from a burning plane. He had simply lied, convincingly and consistently, to people who desperately wanted to believe him. That was his weapon, and he had wielded it with precision. He often said that the real heroes were the soldiers on the beaches, the pilots in the skies, the resistance fighters in occupied territories, people who had risked their lives in direct combat. He had risked his life too, but in a different way, in the shadows, in the silence of coded messages and fabricated reports. His battlefield had been psychological, and his enemy had been the trust and paranoia of the German intelligence system. Juan Pujol García died on October 10, 1988, in Caracas, Venezuela, at the age of 76. He passed away quietly, surrounded by his family, in the same modest anonymity he had tried to preserve for most of his life. His obituaries appeared in newspapers around the world, celebrating him as one of the greatest spies in history, the man who had fooled Hitler and saved D-Day. The British government issued a statement honoring his service. Veterans organizations in America, Britain, and Canada paid tribute to him. But perhaps the most fitting tribute came from the historians and intelligence professionals who continued to study his case long after his death. They marveled not just at what he had accomplished, but at how he had accomplished it, with no formal training, no institutional support in the beginning, and nothing but his own courage, creativity, and an almost superhuman ability to understand how people think and what they want to believe. Juan Pujol had proven that in war, sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't a bomb or a tank. It's a well-told lie delivered by someone the enemy trusts completely. After Juan Pujol's death, historians began the painstaking work of fully documenting the scale and impact of his deception. Declassified German military documents revealed just how deeply the Garbo operation had penetrated Nazi strategic thinking. Intelligence reports that had been filed by the Abwehr and circulated to Hitler's headquarters showed that Garbo's fabricated intelligence had been cited in dozens of high-level military planning sessions. Field Marshal von Rundstedt, the German commander-in-chief in the West, had specifically referenced Garbo's reports when arguing against redeploying forces from Calais to Normandy. Even more astonishing, researchers discovered that as late as July 1944, more than a month after the Normandy invasion, German intelligence analysts were still warning their superiors that the main Allied attack had not yet occurred and that Patton's army group, the phantom force Garbo had invented, remained poised to strike at Calais. The Germans had been so thoroughly convinced by the deception that they continued to believe it, even as the evidence of their mistake became overwhelming. It was a level of psychological manipulation that military strategists still study today as a masterclass in how to weaponize an enemy's assumptions against them. But the Garbo operation also raised uncomfortable questions about the ethics of wartime deception and the human cost of intelligence work. While Juan Pujol had undoubtedly saved Allied lives by keeping German reinforcements away from Normandy, his deception had also inadvertently caused casualties. Some of the intelligence he had fed to the Germans, designed to build his credibility, had been accurate enough that it may have resulted in Allied losses. When Garbo warned the Germans about the Sicily invasion, too late for them to act, but early enough to prove he had access to real information, some historians believe that warning may have cost lives, even if the overall strategic benefit was worth it. MI5 had always understood this moral calculus. To maintain Garbo's credibility, they occasionally had to give the Germans true information, and true information sometimes meant that Allied soldiers would die. The British intelligence officers who ran the operation lived with that weight for the rest of their lives, and Juan Pujol himself, in his later interviews, admitted that it haunted him. He never knew for certain whether any of his reports had directly led to deaths, but the possibility was always there, a shadow over his greatest achievement. The legacy of the Garbo operation extended far beyond World War II. Intelligence agencies in every major country studied his methods and incorporated his techniques into their training programs. The idea of creating entirely fictitious sub-agents, of building a narrative so detailed that the enemy invests emotionally in its reality, became a standard tool in Cold War espionage. The CIA, the KGB, MI6, and the Mossad all ran operations inspired by Garbo's playbook, using elaborate deceptions to mislead adversaries and protect real agents in the field. The concept of strategic deception, which had existed in warfare for centuries, was refined and professionalized because of what Juan Pujol had demonstrated was possible. Military academies around the world began teaching courses on deception operations, using the Garbo case as the foundational example. And in the intelligence community, his codename became shorthand for the gold standard of double-agent work. If you wanted to describe an operation as brilliantly executed, you called it a Garbo-level play. Yet despite all the analysis, all the tributes, and all the historical recognition, one question continued to puzzle researchers. How had Juan Pujol, with no training and no background in espionage, managed to understand the psychology of intelligence work so intuitively? What had given him the ability to predict exactly what the Germans would believe, what details would make his fiction feel real, and how to manipulate their trust without ever overplaying his hand. Some psychologists who studied his case suggested that his experiences during the Spanish Civil War, where he had survived by convincing both sides that he supported them, had given him an instinctive understanding of confirmation bias, the human tendency to believe information that confirms what we already want to believe. Others pointed to his fascination with theatre and cinema, his admiration for actors like Greta Garbo, and argued that he had approached espionage as a form of performance art, where the audience was the German intelligence service and the script was whatever narrative would keep them engaged. Juan Pujol himself offered a simpler explanation in one of his final interviews. He said he had succeeded because he had genuinely tried to think like a German intelligence officer, to understand their fears, their ambitions, and their blind spots, and then gave them exactly what they needed to hear. What made the Garbo operation truly unprecedented wasn't just its success, but the fact that it was almost entirely the creation of one man's imagination. Most successful intelligence operations involve teams of analysts, handlers, cryptographers, and field agents working in coordination. Garbo had started alone, in a hotel room in Lisbon, with nothing but a guidebook and a typewriter, and had built an intelligence network that the Nazis trusted more than their own spies. Even after MI5 took over and professionalized the operation, the core creativity, the character development, the narrative instincts, all of that came from Juan Pujol. His handlers provided logistical support, vetted his messages for consistency, and helped him navigate the technical aspects of wartime communications. But the voice, the personality, the soul of Garbo remained entirely his. And that's what made him irreplaceable. The British could have run the operation with another double agent, but no one else could have created the world that Garbo inhabited, the web of fictional characters and relationships that felt so real to the Germans that they mourned when his imaginary agents died. In the decades since Juan Pujol's story became public, his name has been invoked in some of the most important debates about intelligence, ethics, and the nature of truth in modern society. Philosophers and ethicists have used the Garbo operation as a case study in moral reasoning during wartime. Can deception ever be fully justified even when it saves lives? Legal scholars have examined the operation to understand the boundaries of acceptable conduct in espionage, particularly in democratic societies that claim to value transparency and honesty. And in an era defined by misinformation, fake news, and digital manipulation, the story of a man who created an entire alternate reality and convinced his enemies it was true has taken on new and unsettling relevance. Juan Pujol proved that with enough attention to detail, enough consistency, and enough understanding of your audience, you can make people believe almost anything. That's a powerful lesson in the hands of those fighting for freedom, but it's also a terrifying one in the hands of those who would abuse it. Modern intelligence agencies face a world that would be almost unrecognizable to Juan Pujol. In 1944, communication was slow, verification was difficult, and intelligence officers had to rely heavily on trust and intuition. Today, satellite imagery, digital surveillance, and data analytics have made it exponentially harder to run a deception operation like Garbo's. If the Germans had been able to intercept British communications the way modern intelligence services can monitor digital traffic, if they had been able to cross-reference Garbo's reports against real-time satellite photos, if they had possessed the tools of verification that exist now, the operation would have been exposed in days. And yet experts in cyber warfare and information operations argue that the core principles of the Garbo operation are more relevant than ever. In the age of social media, deepfakes, and algorithmic manipulation, the challenge isn't creating a convincing lie. It's creating a lie that people want to believe, that fits their existing worldview, that confirms their biases. Juan Pujol understood that 70 years before the internet existed. He knew that the most effective deception isn't about overwhelming your enemy with false information. It's about telling them exactly what they already suspect is true. The Garbo operation has also become a symbol of the unsung heroes of World War II, the thousands of intelligence officers, resistance fighters, codebreakers, and support staff whose contributions were classified for decades and whose names are still largely unknown. For every famous general or celebrated war hero, there were dozens of people like Juan Pujol working in secret, taking enormous risks and achieving victories that would never be publicly acknowledged. The codebreakers at Bletchley Park who cracked the Enigma machine, the French resistance members who sabotaged German supply lines, the scientists who developed radar and proximity fuses, these were the people who won the war just as much as the soldiers on the front lines. But their stories were buried under layers of classification and secrecy. Juan Pujol's emergence from anonymity in the 1980s gave hope to historians that other forgotten heroes might still be out there, waiting to be rediscovered, and it sparked a wave of declassification efforts that have gradually revealed the true complexity of Allied intelligence operations during the war. But perhaps the most profound aspect of Juan Pujol's legacy is what his story says about the nature of courage. We tend to think of courage in physical terms: soldiers charging into battle, pilots flying dangerous missions, firefighters running into burning buildings. Juan Pujol's courage was different. It was the courage to sit alone in a room, knowing that if he made one mistake in a letter, if he contradicted something he had written months earlier, if he misjudged the psychology of his German handlers, thousands of people might die and the war might be lost. It was the courage to carry a secret so dangerous that he couldn't share it with anyone, not his family, not his friends, not even after the war ended. It was the courage to live a double life, then a triple life, and finally to disappear entirely, erasing himself from history to stay alive. And it was the courage, decades later, to come forward and tell his story, knowing that it would upend the quiet life he had built and expose him to scrutiny, judgment, and the possibility of revenge from those who still hated what he represented. Today, a small plaque in the village of Sainte-Marie-du-Mont in Normandy commemorates Juan Pujol García and the role he played in the success of D-Day. It sits near Utah Beach, one of the landing sites where American troops came ashore on June 6, 1944. Tourists walk past it every day, many without stopping to read it, without understanding who Garbo was or what he did. But for those who do stop, who take a moment to learn his story, the plaque represents something important. A reminder that history is shaped not just by the loud and the visible, but by the quiet and the invisible, by people working in shadows and silence, by those who fight not with weapons but with words, not with violence but with imagination. Juan Pujol García never wanted to be famous. He never sought glory or recognition. He simply saw a war that needed to be won and decided that he would do whatever it took, using the only weapons he had: his mind, his creativity, and his willingness to risk everything on a lie that might save the world. So why don't more people know about Juan Pujol García? Why isn't his name taught in schools alongside Eisenhower, Churchill, and Patton? The answer reveals something uncomfortable about how we remember history. We prefer our heroes to fit a certain mold: brave soldiers, brilliant generals, charismatic leaders. We struggle to celebrate someone whose greatest weapon was deception, whose heroism consisted of lying so effectively that he convinced the enemy to destroy themselves. There's something unsettling about honoring a man who saved thousands of lives by being the world's greatest liar, even when that lie was in service of defeating fascism. And so Juan Pujol's story remained buried for decades, known only to a small circle of intelligence professionals and historians, while the soldiers who benefited from his deception were celebrated as the heroes of D-Day. It wasn't a conspiracy of silence. It was simply easier to tell the story of Normandy as a tale of courage and sacrifice on the beaches than to explain that the battle was won partly by a Spanish bookkeeper sitting in a London safe house, inventing fictional soldiers and making Hitler believe they were real. But the deeper reason Juan Pujol's story was suppressed for so long is that intelligence agencies wanted to preserve the techniques he had pioneered. If the world knew exactly how Garbo had operated, if every detail of his methods became public knowledge, then enemy intelligence services could learn to defend against those tactics. The Garbo playbook, creating fictional sub-agents, feeding the enemy a mix of true and false information, using their own paranoia against them, became a classified blueprint that Western intelligence agencies used throughout the Cold War and beyond. Only when enough time had passed, when the methods had evolved and new technologies had made some of Garbo's techniques obsolete, did governments feel comfortable allowing his story to be told. Even then, certain details remained classified for years, and some aspects of how MI5 coordinated the broader deception around D-Day are still not fully public. Juan Pujol became a ghost twice, once by his own choice after the war, and once by his government's decision to protect the secrets of his craft. In recent years, as the last living witnesses to World War II have passed away, there has been a renewed urgency to preserve stories like Juan Pujol's before they disappear entirely. Documentaries, books, and even a proposed feature film have brought his story to wider audiences, particularly in Spain and Britain, where he is now recognized as a national hero by both countries. In 2004, on the 60th anniversary of D-Day, the British government formally acknowledged that Garbo's deception had been one of the decisive factors in the success of the invasion, and intelligence historians now rank him among the most effective agents in the history of espionage, alongside figures like Oleg Penkovsky, who provided the West with critical intelligence during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Yet even with this recognition, Juan Pujol remains obscure to most people outside the intelligence community. His story doesn't fit neatly into the narratives we tell about World War II. It's too strange, too quiet, too dependent on understanding the subtle mechanics of deception to translate easily into popular culture. And maybe that's fitting. Juan Pujol spent most of his life trying to be invisible, trying to be unremarkable, trying to blend into the background so that no one would look too closely at who he really was. He succeeded at that better than almost anyone in history. He became a ghost, a legend whispered about in the halls of MI5 and the Abwehr, a code name without a face, a story without an author. And when he finally stepped back into the light in the 1980s, he did so reluctantly, uncomfortable with the attention, insisting that he had only done what needed to be done. He never boasted about fooling Hitler, never claimed to be a genius, never sought to profit from his fame. He lived modestly, died quietly, and left behind a legacy that most people will never fully understand. But for those who do understand, for those who study intelligence, strategy, and the invisible wars fought in the shadows of history, Juan Pujol García represents something extraordinary. Proof that one person, armed with nothing but courage, creativity, and an understanding of human psychology, can change the world. The next time you think about D-Day, about the soldiers who stormed those beaches and the generals who planned the invasion, remember the man who wasn't there. Remember the quiet Spanish bookkeeper who sat in a London safe house, typing messages to the enemy, inventing a world that didn't exist and convincing Adolf Hitler that it was real. Remember that while thousands of men fought and died on the coast of Normandy, the reason they had a chance to win was because a failed chicken farmer had spent 3 years telling the most important lie in history. Remember Juan Pujol García, the man who saved D-Day by making the Nazis believe in ghosts. His story is a reminder that heroism comes in many forms, that courage isn't always loud, and that sometimes the most powerful act of resistance is simply refusing to let evil define what is true. In a world increasingly dominated by misinformation and manipulation, where the line between truth and fiction grows blurrier every day, the story of Garbo stands as both a warning and an inspiration. It shows us the incredible power of a well-crafted lie in the hands of someone fighting for justice. And it reminds us to be vigilant, because that same power can be wielded by those who would use deception for far darker purposes. Juan Pujol used his gift to save lives and defeat tyranny. The question we face today is, who controls the narrative, and what will they do with that power?